They're live. Welcome everyone who's joining us virtually for this double session, as you've heard, of Reading Scotland and the Go Mensch project. I'm very happy to introduce to you today Leonie Jungen, who for many of you, of course, doesn't need an introduction because she is from Mainz, but you probably don't know everything about her interesting background. So I've prepared a few details here. Leonie is a PhD candidate and lecturer at the Department of English and Linguistics at Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz. Her background is in communication sciences and English literature and culture, which she studied in Mainz and at the University of Edinburgh. She obtained an MA in English literature in 2021 with a thesis entitled Gender as an Aspect of Scottish National Identity in Sir Walter Scott's and Margaret Oliphant's works. And this thesis was awarded the highest possible mark. She also secured a prestigious PhD scholarship by Studienstiftung des Deutschen Volkes for her PhD project, which mainly keeps her busy these days. It bears the title Tales of a Grandmother, Female Identity and Transgenerational Storytelling in the Age of Scott. So she remains in Scotland. Her publications include the 2022 conference proceedings for the German Association for the Study of English, for which I will eternally be grateful to her and also Sarah Wegener. They co-edited this together. She is the postgrad and early career researcher representative in the International Association for the Study of Scottish Literature. She's also a member of the Scientists for Future, the regional group in Mainz and Wiesbaden. And I have a feeling that for her talk today, which will take us not into the past as her previous projects have done, but into the present, the conjunction of the environment with Scotland is the theme. The title of her talk today, unless it has changed, is Once There Were Humans, Surrealism and the Post-Anthropocene in Contemporary Fiction. And the text to which she is applying her ideas is a 2021 novel by the Australian writer Charlotte McConaghy, which is set in the Scottish Cairngorms. And the title of this novel is Once There Were Wolves. And with this, I hand over to Leonie.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I will take a moment to share my presentation, and I hope this works because I've never done this in a hybrid format like this. So stick with me for a second. Nothing appears, which is great. We've just tested this, so it should work. Fingers crossed. Maybe if I change screens, if someone online could give me an idea whether they can see slides or not.
Yeah, we can see slides.
Okay, fantastic. Then we're all set. Yeah, thank you for this kind of introduction, and also thank you for the opportunity to give this talk for the both Go Mensch project 2024 and also the Reading Scotland online community. Before I start my talk, I would like to give a short trigger warning because in academic contexts we move towards this. So be aware that this talk centers around graphic depictions of domestic violence and gendered violence. So if this is a sensitive topic for you, be aware that large parts of this talk will center around this. For me as a scholar, this is also a bit of an excursus because in my research, I focus on Scottish national tales, so literature of the 19th century, and this is contemporary fiction. I don't usually engage with eco-criticism or ecofeminism, the Anthropocene, or let alone the Post-Anthropocene. But the climate crisis is a topic that is very dear to my heart. And I feel that the humanities must engage with it much more than they do to this point, especially literary studies. And yeah, since literature has always been a medium to engage with social, philosophical, moral, political, and also scientific discourses, the climate crisis should be much more prominent than it currently is. And when I walk through bookstores, I often ask myself why it is not more present in literature as it is, especially mainstream literature. So I have condensed my thoughts on this into the two discussion questions, which will come up hopefully in a second. Wait, there we go. The first one being, and I would like to keep them, I would like to ask you to keep them in mind throughout the talk, so that we can exchange ideas about this afterwards, because I'm very much interested in your opinion on this. Must mainstream literature move past the Anthropocene and towards the Post-Anthropocene to negotiate the full scale of the climate crisis and its accompanying social challenges, and also to inspire climate activism? And as a second question, is surrealism the way to go about this? So how does surrealism support, but maybe also underline this? Just to keep them in mind for the end of my talk. As Rainer already mentioned, my talk centers around the novel Once There Were Wolves by Charlotte McConaughey, which was published in 2021. And it tells the story of Inti Flynn, a young biologist in her 30s who arrives in Abernethy in Scotland together with her twin sister Aggie. And Inti is one of the leading scientists who is in charge of the Cairngorms Wolf Project. And the aim of this project is to release 2 packs of wolves into the Scottish Highlands, the Cairngorms to be precise, to rewild the region. And hopes are that the local wolf community will grow again and keep the deer population in check so that the trees can grow again and help to lower carbon dioxide emissions in Scotland. So this is supposed to be a blueprint for other rewilding projects worldwide. After much protest from the local farming community who fears for their livestock, the project seems to progress successfully, and Inti herself starts to get to know the residents better, but also their dark secrets. And so she learns that one of the farmers, going by the name Stuart, is physically abusive of his wife, Leonie, which seems to be an open secret amongst the residents of Abernethy, including the police officer, Duncan, with whom Inti later starts to have an affair and also gets pregnant. One night on her way home through the woods, she comes across Stuart's body, which looks like it was thrown open or torn open by canine teeth. But being a wolf expert, Inti knows that this is not what canine wounds or wolf bites look like. So she senses that this is a smear campaign against their project and against the rewilding aim of the Highlands. And she decides to bury his body and deliberately mislead the investigation. The novel was published to great critical acclaim, as this review from the Los Angeles Times shows. Here it says that, as McConaughey shows in this stunning book, the limits of language lead us to the limits of empathy. And this is exactly what I would like to focus on in my talk, to explore where does language end, or where are the limits of language and where are the limits of empathy, but also how can we employ them, maybe for climate activism, but also in terms of handling the climate crisis. My talk is therefore structured like this. I will start with a very brief introduction to climate fiction and the Post-Anthropocene. Then I will do a little excursus into the historical part of it with the myth of the Highlands, humans versus nature. And then we will go into the analysis of Once There Were Wolves through exemplary scenes from the novel, which focus on gender, violence, and the natural environment and how these components interact. And also empathy as supernatural power as it is depicted through Inti's ability in the novel, before hopefully coming to a conclusion if once there was hope or maybe there is still hope. Before we get into the analysis, we must clarify a few key terms because I'm not sure if everyone is aware of climate fiction and the concept of the Post-Anthropocene. So I'm sure that all of you have heard at least to some extent, of the Anthropocene. But has anybody here come across climate fiction before, or have you read climate fiction? Fiction that specifically centers around the climate crisis, not just dystopian fiction, but fiction that is engaged with the climate crisis and the effects of it. Yes, one person. Okay. Yeah, very good. We will also get to that later. Any other examples? Yes. Sorry again. Interesting. Yeah, also a great example. Okay, great. So we've already got a few people who are familiar with it. Fantastic. For the rest, I hope that I can tell you something new and maybe intrigue you in this specific genre. Climate fiction as such is not even considered a literary genre, at least not in the classical sense, like science fiction or Western, where we can say these are specific tropes of climate fiction, because climate fiction mixes several aspects of other genres. The term was actually coined by the media, especially the journalist Dan Bloom in the late 2000s, who was both active as a journalist as well as a climate activist. And climate fiction as term, but also as genre, if we can call it that, started to gain momentum in the 2010s with a surge both in media coverage and publications, which doesn't mean, of course, that there was no climate fiction before the 2010s. It was just referred to as something different. So there have been influential works before that. And the most recent and influential work, which some of you might have heard about because it has been in the media, especially with its effects, is Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, which was published in 2020. And following this publication, Robinson was even invited to and consulted by the Pentagon. So it goes to show that literature can not only contribute to the discussion of the climate crisis and its results or its issues and its challenges, but it can actually also offer maybe even solutions. Elements of climate fiction are the anthropogenic climate change and the political, social, psychological, and ethical issues associated with it. So the focus is mostly on the Anthropocene and humans as authors of their environment. So humans take a central role in climate fiction. It is set in the world as we know it, in the near future, or fictional worlds that center around climate change. And it usually deals with utopian and dystopian visions, sci-fi elements, and also parts of thriller tropes. And it usually follows a preoccupation with authenticity that draws on exactly what climate fiction fabricates. So within climate fiction, we often encounter extracts from newspapers, for example, or social media posts that try to generate a greater sense of authenticity, of selling us that world, basically. So yeah, we have a mix-up of different textual genres. One means that is usually employed to create authenticity too is the use of advanced technologies. Examples for this can be climate engineering and practices for adaptation to climate changes, but also recently, of course, the use of artificial intelligence. The first sci-fi work, if we can call it that, was Late Heat of Heaven by Ursula Le Guin in 1971. And here you've got a very short and very superficial list of other climate fiction works. If you're interested in diving deeper into this topic, prominent works would be Arthur Herzog's Heat from 1977, T.C. Boyer's A Friend of the Earth from 2000, or also Margaret Atwood's The Year of the Flood, published in 2009. Concerning the post-Anthropocene, we face a similar problematic of defining it because there is no such thing as a set definition of what post-anthropocentrism or the post-Anthropocene can look like. And the reason why that is that futurities are usually imagined in the post-Anthropocene that unite the intersection of human, nature, and technology. And since we don't know what the future will look like, there are various possibilities in which directions this can go. So I've tried to compile a few which I found particularly interesting and which might be thought-provoking to you too. So the post-Anthropocene, as I said, has no clear definition. And it usually negotiates past and present elsewheres. So it takes us to a different place that exceeded the geological grammar and praxis of the Scenic, providing portals onto non-geological spatial futures, or what we call the Post-Anthropocene. And these non-geological futures are basically, or this idea of these non-geological spaces refers to the idea of social spaces. And this comes from a completely different strand of research. It refers to the Black Outdoors. This was a term that was coined by the Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke University, and they looked in community studies of Black life resilience and survival against the odds of white domination through colonization and slavery. So what they basically did was research what kind of effects Black people face in their understanding of freedom and also their imaginations of the outdoors. So we have this contrasting of being trapped indoors, if we imagine the context of slavery, and then imagine what freedom, what the outdoors looks like. So this is the very, very basic idea behind the Post-Anthropocene. So this is where it comes from or originates from. Another term that was quite central to this is Martin Heidegger's Homo humanus. This refers to a perpetually vigilant state of caring that mediates the relationship among humans, technique, and nature to guard against the human becoming inhuman outside his essence. So in order to ensure that the Post-Anthropocene doesn't become too inhumane, we need a perpetual vigilant state of caring, a greater state of caring to ensure that. And one idea of what the Post-Anthropocene can look like and how it can shape our everyday lives is the so-called black stack. This is the idea that a technology that already in parts exists in the form of AI, but also does not quite exist in this finalized version as it is imagined in the black stack, creates new forms of policies, maybe, or even governmental structures that we as humans cannot come up with, and which proposes solutions for our everyday problems, but also in particular climate change and the climate crisis. So one of the integral accidents of the black stack may be an anthrocidal trauma that shifts us from a design career as the authors of the Anthropocene to the role of supporting actors in the arrival of the Post-Anthropocene. And the term anthrocidal trauma refers to the event of a possible genocide or a possible mass extinction of humans, similar to ecocide, so the collapse of the ecological system through humans. It basically imagines a scenario in which humanity collapses, and this causes those who survive it trauma, and this results in anthrocidal trauma. This is what the term refers to. Examples for this can be habitat destruction, nuclear war, pandemics, deliberate and non-deliberate acts of mass destruction and mass extinction of humans. And I realized that this does not necessarily paint a very optimistic or utopian vision of the future. And so I thought maybe to understand the future, we should probably first look to the past and see how these things or where they come from, and how the basis of this negotiation looks like. So to the past we shall look. And in this case, we look to Scotland, the setting of this novel, the Scottish Highlands. And in the case of Once There Were Wolves, this is particularly interesting because the Highlands have always been a chessboard of sorts. First, they have been one for the political and social negotiations of the nation's future in the union with England. And second, the actual geographical implications of such future visions. Not only did the discussion weigh the political outcomes for Scotland, and in particular the Highland communities following the Highland clearances, Many 19th century writings, no matter if Scottish national tales, travel writings, or novels, continuously reference the impact of the supposed English progress on the Scottish soil, land enclosures, for example, being a prominent progressive structure to name here, which in turn heavily affected the farm communities and resulted in mass emigration, and of course also destruction of the landscape. As Peter Womack points out in his writings on the construction of the Highland myth, the Scottish soil held a double meaning. On the one hand, this is a quote from his writings, as an object of investment, it is something like a raw material destined to be valorized by the ingenuity and enterprise of the owner, but the land is also the origin of value. From its natural virtue, the landlord derives at once his material wealth, the legitimation of his power, and the standards of propriety by which his artificial works may be judged. So to summarize this, on the one hand, the Highlands hold material value as land that can be worked and land that can produce goods. On the other hand, it holds symbolic or natural value, which determines not only the quality of the goods, but also the virtue of the people that produce them. And provided, of course, it is fertile land that we are talking about. Things are slightly different when we talk about the spectator side of things. Infertile land, barren land, land that cannot be worked, might be of little to no value to the people living in it, but Womack suggests that this kind of land seems to the spectator as a kind of limit text. This means that the ruggedness and infertility of the landscape strengthens its picturesque effect, so it sets it apart from what we would determine as fertile land that is covered in forests, for example. So to name an example, which is not the Highlands, maybe deserts, for example, they can also have picturesque value to us, even though they don't offer fertility for growing crops or producing goods, so to say. And naturally, there is not just barrenness in the Highlands. Before humans settled there, the Scottish Highlands were covered by the Caledonian forest, which due to a change in climate was drastically reduced between 7000 BC and 2000 BC, with its biggest span at around 5000 BC, covering almost the entirety of the Highlands. Besides climate change, which was naturally not just human-made back then, it was the grazing of sheep and deers after humans settled in the Highlands, which caused it to shrink to its current size, at which it has stagnated since 1600, roughly. Today, the Scottish pines of the Caledonian forest still cover about 180 square kilometers, with the biggest sections located in Glenfalloch, Strathspey, and the Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park, which is located just north of Glasgow. And it is also explicitly referenced in McConaughey's Once There Were Wolves. She describes there the little cottage where both Inti and Aggie live, quote unquote from the novel. Blue Cottage isn't far from the project base camp. Both cottage and camp sit on the edge of Abernethy Forest, one of the last remnants of the ancient Caledonian forest that arrived here after the Ice Age. These old trees belong to an unbroken 9,000-year evolutionary chain, and it's within them that we place the closest wolf pen, the one containing wolves 6, 9, and 13. So, as opposed to the barrenness of parts of the Highlands, the landscape is also associated with a primitive and nearly untouched wilderness or wildness, mostly symbolized in the novel through trees, which are also described as almost otherworldly, always glittering or whispering, or sometimes even being sneaky. So they are ascribed characteristics just as humans. And first, we have the wild side of the Highlands that is considered a site of picturesque beauty, especially when it is incorporated into the greater system, meaning the Grand Tour of Europe that young aristocrats embarked on in the late 18th and early 19th century. So their wilderness or wildness was always incorporated into this greater system of wildernesses throughout Europe, therefore consisting an image of beauty. On the other hand, the beauty of the Highlands wilderness was described by Sir William Burrell, one of the first tourists to the Highlands in 1758, as quote unquote, equally horrible, barbarous, and disagreeable. Not necessarily adjectives that come to mind when you think of Loch Lomond or Glencoe or other nice parts of the Highlands. But indeed, there were two sides of this landscape. And interestingly, these two sides were connected by water, because water was considered the literal medium of communication that mediated between the contrasting sides of the infertility of the land and its fertile side, the wilderness. And especially trees served as a reminder that life was cultivated in the Highlands, since they are water-retaining organisms and therefore also life-retaining organisms. So where there is water, there are trees, and where there are trees, there is life. So the geographical circumstances alone already suggest that the Highlands are a landscape of opposites, of binaries, and not just in the natural sense. Whether it is Gaelic versus English, for example, we have the Gaelic culture and the English culture. The language, the manners, values, literature, music, the written tradition, the oral tradition. We can continue that list endlessly. Obviously, that is the big binary that takes the first place, so to say. But we also have nature versus culture, so the need to preserve and cultivate the landscape at the same time. We have nationalism, a place of Jacobite uprisings, for example, strong nationalism, the hotbed for otherness as opposed to Englishness. But we also have immigration and dispossession as a result of the Highland clearances. So large-scale poverty, also one aspect of this. There is obviously also community versus capitalism, sympathy, which is a stereotypically Scottish character trait, versus profit, usually embodied, especially in national tales, by the capitalist-driven English merchants or landlords. We've got surrealism, especially associated with the Caledonian forest, which features in the legends of King Arthur and Merlin. But also other myths like the Kelpies, the Changelings, Nessie, Macpherson's Ossian poetry. There are multiple examples of this, but also realism on the other hand, especially the Scottish national tales, which portray this large mass-scale poverty that we see in the early 19th century. We have primitiveness versus progress, solitude versus society. We could continue that list endlessly. So I think I've made my point clear. The Highlands are a place of binaries and opposites. But the overarching bias still remains the humans versus nature dichotomy, also known as the myth of the Highlands. The myth of the Highlands is described as a social construction of the Highlands as untouched nature, which emerged throughout the historic periods of economic and social improvements, romanticization, and Balmoralisation, each denying the actual conditions of existence, specifically the landscape's social and cultural history and the lives of inhabitants. This is rather complex, so I'll try to break it down a little bit. What Zoe Russell maps out here is the emergence of the untouched, supposedly origin Celtic soil of Britain that never existed, but is nothing short of a social construct. Then she identifies the period of the economic and social improvements of the 18th century with the Highland clearances and the employment of land enclosures. She names the romanticization in reference to the Romantic era, especially, of course, Sir Walter Scott, who contributed greatly to the romanticization of Highlanders and Highland communities alike. And constructed Scotland, as we could say, as a place of the past that you can travel to and explore, almost like a theme park, which kickstarted the Scottish tourism industry. And of course, we've got Queen Victoria's obsession with Highland culture in the second half of the 19th century when Albert acquired Balmoral Castle, which led to the a very difficult term to pronounce, Balmoralisation of Scottish culture. So they completely demolished Balmoral Castle, rebuilt it again at a different place in Scottish a moral and a baronial and Gothic style. And this, of course, has been the British monarchy's summer routine ever since, and now famously the death place of Queen Elizabeth. So we see a stark period of destruction and improving aggression in the Highlands in the 18th century, followed by a period of remodeling and curating landscape over the course of the 19th century, according to a myth that turns nature from the dark other, so to say, into goodness and productivity. Peter Womack describes this quite beautifully in his quote, "As the country was emptied, its emptiness was mythologized as part of its aboriginal character. The sublime and the clearances were secretly paired, the golden chains broken ends." So in other words, something highly valued and beautiful seems tragically lost in the process of making it usable. We'll return to the ambiguity of that in a moment, but what I would like to emphasize here regarding the myth of the Highlands is the effect of othering that it produces. In this process, nature is defined as something humans are not. So nature is constantly made the other, either barrenness or fertility, depending on the landscape, of course, that you're looking at. And this brings me finally to the novel, Once There Were Wolves. In the novel, nature and culture are continuously figured as opposites, with either nature or culture taking the position of the one deviating from the norm, so taking the place of the other. In fact, the whole novel is completely pervaded by binaries, and I compiled a list here of all the binaries that I could find. Neither of these sides, I must say, is representative of a good or a bad side. Despite the contrasting themes, the novel does not engage in black and white thinking. It is rather central to the idea of negotiating between two sides and showcasing that depending on what kind of perspective you take, both sides can be interpreted as either good or bad. So I sorted this basically into Inti's characteristics or topics that she engages with, which would be on the side where wolves and creatures and wilderness are located, and then what she is confronted with by other people, which is on the left-hand side, humans, monsters, civilization, and so on. So I won't go through all of these binaries, but I'd like to highlight a few since these are the ones that my subsequent analysis focuses on. The first one that we have is, of course, I hope this works. It doesn't. Never mind. The first is humans, monsters versus wolves, creatures. So to give you an example, the novel opens with the line, "When we were 8, Dad cut me open from throat to stomach." This is not to be taken literal, of course. So this is just referring to Inti's ability to be greatly empathetic of everything that she sees. And she experiences the pain that a rabbit experiences when her father cuts it open from head to stomach. So from the very beginning of the narratives, human and men in particular are portrayed as destructors of nature and even killers. They are introduced to us through the act of violence and are therefore turned into monsters. While the opening scene refers to the act of killing a rabbit as part of the self-sustainable life Inti's father leads, it sets the tone for the novel as a whole. In another exemplary scene, where the Cairngorms Wolf Project is presented to the local Highland community and is met with heavy protest, Inti explains to the angry farmers and residents, "If you truly think wolves are the blood spillers, then you're blind. We do that. We are the people killers, the children killers. We are the monsters." Wolves, on the other hand, are described as mysterious creatures. When Inti's dad teaches her how to correctly interpret a rare wolf's trace, since they usually don't leave those, Inti asks, "How did it move with no tracks like that?" "The infinite mystery of wolves," Dad replied, "and I decided then that I would discover the creature's secrets." Or when Inti is accompanied home by the police officer Duncan, he says to her, "You must know monsters well, wolf girl." And she replies, "I've never met one in the wild. They don't live there." Yeah, you get the idea. This goes to show that Inti regards neither the wolves nor the wilderness as danger or threat. Rather the contrary, it's the home, the domestic, that she associates with danger and lack of safety. Wolves in the novel actually never kill. They even protect, and sometimes they also attack, but they never attack to kill. While wolves are linked to the wilderness, at the same time, they are located within the Scottish landscape as the other to humans, the other that doesn't contribute to its destruction, but actually counteracts it. This is again a quote from the novel. "It is bleak terrain down there to the south, where we have placed them. Few trees, but then wolves don't need forests. They grow them." This links naturally the wolves with the Scottish wilderness threatened by human civilization. And the community threatens from the beginning to shoot any wolf that sets foot on their land. So unfortunately, this does happen when Inti discovers the corpse of wolf number 9. The wolf seems to blend into the soil and become one with the land. "I see his body long before we reach it, grey fur nestled into the earth, cradled by it. He is lying beside a stream that borders the farm, and he is on the forest side of the stream. And as I make sense of this, I realize he has been shot without having crossed over onto McRae's land." So this showcases the senseless killing of the wolf, while the wolf is on life's side, the side of the trees, and not the side of humans, the farmland where they would have the right to kill it. And it enforces the life-death frontier that we are continuously encountering in the novel. And in this scene, we also witness Inti's immense empathy with her environment. "Wild, floundering despair and a rage so hot I think I will scream, or vomit, or turn and strangle Red by the throat. Instead, I sink to the ground beside 9 and place my trembling hands in his fur as I never would have done when he was alive. They fade into the background, and all I am is this wolf, and all I see is the beauty of him, and the power even now, even so reduced. There is blood in 9's fur. I can't yet see where he was shot, but his eyes are open and glassy, and his tongue is lolling out, and the sight is so upsetting that I feel a shift come upon me. This feeling is why we don't give them names, why we don't go near to them, because they are so fragile." I will go into further detail about Inti's talent of empathy in that moment, but for now, I would like to focus on the reactions of the other characters to her very strong reaction to number 9's death, because these reactions are completely omitted in the novel, which makes Inti's emotional reaction stand out even more. Instead, there is shock concerning Inti's reaction. "I look up at Red and he recoils from whatever he sees in my face. There is a kind of embarrassment in him that I should be so openly vulnerable, so wounded, so blazing." And blazing, I think, is quite an interesting adjective to use here because we're in the middle of the forest. So any blaze would set the trees on fire. And this goes to show basically what or how strong the emotions are that Inti feels in that moment and how threatening they are to the life around her. So we could say that she, in this scene, is at the brink of becoming a monster herself, maybe out of grief for the dying wolf. But it's not just inaction or recoil from emotion that is contrasted with Inti's empathy. Throughout the novel, we encounter time and time again instances of domestic violence, both displayed by men and women, with a slight surplus on the male side. Here, McConaughey knows how to play with expectations. While we could interpret the opening scene of the novel, Inti's father cutting a rabbit open and her feeling the pain as if it was her as an act of parental abuse, we quickly learn that it's not Inti's father that is abusive, but her mother. Both of the parents' workplaces, her dad's workshop in the woods and her mother's office in the city, are places of bruises and blood and death. With the difference that Inti's father kills animals to consume them, so to stay alive, while her mother works as a lawyer to convict criminals, more precisely perpetrators of domestic violence and femicide. In turn, Inti's mother acts in some scenes like a perpetrator herself. For example, since Inti is so sensitive to pain and everything or suffering that she is faced with, her mother believes that she must toughen up and she cuts herself with a blade for as long as it takes for Inti not to feel pain anymore. So here we are clearly faced with a misunderstanding of empathy from both sides and a lack of communication or lack of negotiation to communicate that. So even within the binary of empathy and violence, we can spot a further binary of physical and emotional violence, both linked with nature and civilization respectively. This becomes apparent when Inti's mother explains to her little daughter their separate living situations, because her father lives in the Canadian forest and her mother lives in a big city in Australia somewhere. It's never clarified in the novel. Because I wanted a career and he didn't want to leave his forest, is what she says. So even between the parents, there was no compromise possible. Communication, again, has failed between nature and city. To make a long story of binaries a bit shorter, I propose that this contrasting can be traced back to a literary trope that is common in climate fiction and any work that deals with the unraveling of the social order in the wake of the climate crisis, and that is the social collapse. The imagination from the social collapse also opens up the possibility of other worlds and thereby also actualizes the interpretation of other kinds of relations to the world. Thus, the framework for these interpretations will not solely rest on the idea that anthropogenic global warming leads to a violent struggle between individuals in a space devoid of institutions, but more precisely the idea that global warming exposes and intensifies interhuman division. To be more concrete, this means that the social collapse does not always appear in Western climate fiction through representations of violent conflict. Rather, in climate fiction utilizing the social collapse, the use of violence marks different degrees of loss in socio-political complexity. The more interhuman violence is represented as a necessary individual mode of action, the more apparent is the loss of socio-political complexity. So, very complex topic, but to break it down, intensified polarization and division are expected as effects of the climate crisis, which is a logical explanation. And the more apparent social and political loss of society become, the greater is the extent of interhuman violence. So the greater the division, the greater the violence we have to deal with. And while Once There Were Wolves doesn't take the image of the social collapse so far that the entire social construct collapses into itself, it does something even more profound and more thought-provoking, in my opinion, because it suggests that the start of the social collapse can be traced by the increased level of domestic violence and basically to the state that we are currently in. So it suggests if there is domestic violence, then the start of the social collapse has already begun, which puts us into a very daunting position, I think. McConaughey makes this abundantly clear in this sentence when the scientists hold a panel discussion at the start of the Cairngorms Wolf Project and are met with resistance from the local community. It is unacceptable to me, says a farmer who is present at this panel discussion, that animals could be introduced that would destroy the Highlander way of life. I want to see a thriving community. I want to see glens dotted with sheep and people. People are the lifeblood of a place. A whistle, a smattering of applause. I stare at the back of the farmer. This world he describes, empty of wild creatures and places, overrun instead of people and their agriculture, is a dying world. And what is implicit here is that as readers, of course, we know that the world that the farmer describes, empty of wild creatures and places, overrun instead of people and their agriculture, sounds very much like the world that we are currently living in. So it is suggested that we are already living in a dying world. And in such scenes, we are also confronted with the inability of the two sides, again, a binary, to interact with each other and properly communicate with each other, because these sides seem inconsolable. On the one hand, we have the farmer and the people whistling their support for his opinion, who is unaccepting of the wolves. And on the other side, we have Inti, who is unable to meet this protest with words. She just stares back at him, basically at a loss for words. So again, in this scene, communication or dialogue fails. It gets more apparent when the narrative arrives at the subplot, which reveals the reason for Aggie's, Inti's twin sister's, silence, and that is domestic violence. Inti and Aggie have always communicated through sign languages, as children do, so they made up signs in order to communicate with each other so that nobody could listen in on what they have to say. But in the present day, this sign language has become the only means for Aggie to interact with her surroundings, and therefore the only person that she can still interact with is Inti, her sister, and nobody else. There are languages without words, and violence is one of them. By the time we were 10, there was the sign language Addie had invented so we could communicate privately. She'd built a world for the two of us to live within, and we would each be perfectly happy never to leave it. When we were 16, she started learning the language of violence. She broke a boy's nose, and she did it for me, as most of the things she did were for me. And as an interesting side fact, she breaks that boy's nose with a poetry book. So she still uses a silent means of communication in order to express violence. And this is the most heartbreaking and yet also the most painful binary of the novel, because it is one that we can all empathize with to some extent, because it is outspokenness versus action. Aggie's narrative revolves around her marriage with Gus, who is extremely violent with her, and Inti gets drawn into this relationship when Gus starts having an affair with her after supposedly mixing up the twins' identities. And Aggie knows about this and tolerates it, even encourages it, just as she tolerates Gus's violence towards her. She falls more and more quiet over the course of their marriage, until language eventually fails her and she completely retreats to sign language, which makes Inti the only one who can still communicate with her. Inti, on the other hand, takes action. She actively threatens Gus in an act of revenge and defense and moves their home to Scotland, pouring all of her energy into the rewilding project and in caring for her sister. And she tells her sister the cover story that she has actually murdered Gus. If we return to the thought that domestic violence can serve as a symptom of the climate crisis, we are presented with two possibilities. Either we fail or we fall into a state of inactivity and tolerance, as Aggie does, and tolerate also injustice and even violence, or we take action and we fight back, like Inti. Researchers have found that socially and geographically disadvantaged people, especially those who face discrimination based on gender, age, race, class, caste, indigeneity, and disability, are particularly vulnerable to climate hazards. So since we live in a patriarchy, this puts everyone who is not white, male, heterosexual, of modestly wealthy background and without disabilities in a less fortunate position than those who are. But we can also flip the coin, fortunately, to the positive side, because countries with higher representation of women in national parliaments follow more stringent climate change policies across countries, resulting in lower carbon dioxide emissions, which is quite a positive outlook. So both of these examples demonstrate that there's a clear link between the way nations handle gender equality and also the climate crisis. And in ecofeminism, this has been linked to the problem of gendered violence. So the destructiveness of the Anthropocene is rooted in the interlink of the violation of women and the natural environment. So the way that these nations treat their environment is also a testament to how they treat the women in society. In Once There Were Wolves, Inti experiences this firsthand when she accuses Stuart, the farmer who is abusive of his wife, of domestic violence. Again, a quote from the novel: "For better or for worse, I must speak. I must speak. Anyone here," I ask, holding his eyes, "think it's a strong man who beats his wife? I have broken the code, given voice to what they don't speak of." Here again, similar to Aggie's silence, the lack of verbal communication is equated with inaction or toleration of violence. And in that silent community, the men staying silent, staying inactive, actively contribute to the violation of women. So In the end, it is female solidarity, Aggie learning the language of violence to defend Inti in their childhood, and Inti provoking Stuart to save his wife Leonie in order to draw the attention to her so that he will hurt her and she can actually file charges against him that opposes the male violence inflicted on the female characters. And as the climax of the novel, which is revealed towards the end, Aggie, the one that is usually silent and retreated into herself, murders Stuart when he comes to their house the night Inti is out and in the woods, and when she later comes across his corpse and thinks this was a staged murder in order to smear the Wolf Project. So in the end, Aggie does take action as an act of female solidarity. The level of empathy that Inti displays in Once We Were Wolves is by no means an ordinary one, which brings me to the last analytical part of this talk. From the beginning, it is deliberately framed as a supernatural gift that is a curse in equal measure. Inti describes it like this. I am unlike most people. I move through life in a different way, with an entirely unique understanding of touch. Before I knew its name, I knew this. To make sense of it, it is called a neurological condition. Mirror touch synesthesia. My brain recreates the sensory experiences of living creatures, of all people and even sometimes animals. If I see it, I feel it, and for just a moment I am them. We are one, and their pain or pleasure is my own. It can seem like magic, and for a long time I thought it was, but really it's not so far removed from how other brains behave. The physiological response to witnessing someone's pain is a cringe, a recoil, a wince. We are hardwired for empathy. Once upon a time, I took delight in feeling what others felt. Now the constant stream of sensory information exhausts me. Now I'd give anything to be cut free. And again, we are faced with a binary here. On the one hand, it is seemingly a magical power that Inti possesses, which at the same time becomes the reason of Inti's exhaustion and thus a curse to her. I would also like to draw your attention here to the fact that Inti does not speak of either pleasure or pain. She does not ascribe this magic a value. She just says that once upon a time, I took delight in feeling what others felt. Now the constant stream of sensory information exhausts me. And yet the narrative opens with a rather cruel scene where Inti takes the place of the rabbit and experiences firsthand how it feels to be cut open, which is obviously not a pleasurable experience. Rather than her empathy being only valuable to her when she experiences positive emotions, these scenes illustrate that feeling someone's pain, feeling suffering, can also be a valuable experience because in turn it encourages more empathy and sympathy and works in a cycle. And another aspect that the narrator includes here is that on one side, she highlights the outstanding quality of Inti's ability as magic, but on the other side, she stresses that really it's not so far removed from how other brains behave. The physiological response to witnessing someone's pain is a cringe, a recoil, a wince. We are hardwired for empathy. And here she refers to the we. So she roots the ability to feel what others feel, to have this kind of mirror touch, this heightened empathy, as something that every human possesses to a certain extent. And even points out that it is something we are naturally sensitive about, hardwired for. And wolves in the novel are included in this way too, because they also feel empathy. They actually protect Inti when she gives birth in the woods and prevent her child from dying in the cold. So why relate empathy to wolves and not just human beings? I have mentioned before that in ecofeminism, gendered violence and the environment are linked, and the destructiveness of the Anthropocene is rooted in the interlink of the violation of women and the natural environment. In the novel, wolves are not just animals roaming the Scottish landscape, they are perceived by the local farm community as a threat to their livestock and their own lives too. Most notably, it is only the men that perceive them as threat. Simultaneously, it is women like Leonie that suffer due to the remoteness of the place, the fact that the community is so tight-knit that it allows husbands to abuse their wives without any form of punishment or legal consequence, because everybody sticks together and everybody keeps that secret. To return to the metaphorical death of wolf number 9, which I mentioned before, whose corpse is found between the barren farmland and the fertile woods, women like Leonie and also Inti and Aggie are caught in a situation where they are trapped on the brink of life and death, namely domestic violence, that results in repeated hospitalizations in a state close to death. So they are trapped at a threshold. In the middle of the highlands, the women have become the very limit text that the landscape embodies, that surrounds them, barren and fertile at the same time. And Inti finds herself in the middle of this. The view from Blue Cottage, where Inti is staying with her twin sister Aggie, is described as follows. Made of grayish blue stone and flanked by a couple of grassy paddocks, during the day its view is twofold. To the south lies thick beckoning forest. To the north, long bare hills that come spring will be covered in grazing red deer. So again, we have on the one side the fertile forests, on the other side the barren land. Alice Walker, a scholar working on ecofeminism and animals in literature, has theorized that as sentient beings with the ability to suffer, a clear desire not to suffer, and their own devious individuality, non-human animals are as deserving of moral consideration as humans, or as are humans. And yet in the Highlands, or in the Highland community of Abernethy, women do not receive the same moral consideration as men. Men of the community protect each other. Women are not considered in this net of protection. And they take basically the same position as the wolves. Inti constantly mediates between the two sides of the community while trying to save Leonie, trying to save also the police chief Duncan from his own past, and falling pregnant in the process, thus carrying life within herself. As mediator, she does not only bury Stuart's body in the forest to protect Leonie and the wolves alike, a metaphorical act of burying the perpetrator in the fertile ground that he attacked in the first place. She also reveals to Aggie, her twin sister, that she has supposedly killed her abusive husband Gus years ago, which allows Aggie to finally leave the house again, which she has been confined to out of fear for her life ever since they became involved. And the reason Inti does so is due to her belief that all humans are intrinsically good. She affirms, I would not be broken. I had a magic power that wasn't magic. I felt what other people felt, and I knew what lived in those touches and how it was mostly sweetness. You didn't touch sweetly unless you were good. So despite the depressing and dark tone of the novel, there is a reassurance underscoring the narrative that while some people may act with malicious intent, generalization does not serve a purpose at all and contributes to the division of society rather than its reconciliation. This brings me to my last remarks on the novel and my interpretation of the novel's depiction of the Highlands as ecological traumascape. Traumascapes after Maria Turbekin are defined as spaces that hold power and significance. Usually they are battlefields. The battlefield of Culloden, for example, would be a prominent traumascape in the Highlands, or also the battlefield of Stirling Bridge. In the novel, these places are of ecological significance for the climate, therefore also a place that holds power over carbon dioxide emissions and therefore humanity as a whole. They are material places constituted through experienced and imagined repetitions of trauma. In the novel, this also refers to scapes like the Snow Goose, that is a local pub, which is often the scene of conflict between men of the community, but also where Inti provokes Stuart in hitting her so that she can file charges against him. And they also elicit, shape, and sustain remembering. The devastation of nature continuously shapes the landscape and acts as visual memory of the destruction of nature in the novel. For example, the scene that I've mentioned earlier, both cottage and camp sit on the edge of Abernethy Forest, one of the last remnants of the ancient Caledonian forest that arrived here after the Ice Age. These old trees belong to an unbroken 9,000-year evolutionary chain. And trees are also often described as storages of memory. This is also a quote from the novel, "The memory of 40,000 aspens breathing around me, their canopy not naked, but carnary yellow and as vivid as his voice in my ear. It's dying, we are killing it." Traumascapes can also act as filters for identities and meaning. For Inti and Aggie, they are filters because they rework their relationship and their shared trauma in the middle of the Highlands. And this is also where Inti reveals her supposed murder of Gus, allowing Aggie to free herself of her own past and trauma that she experienced. Traumascapes also facilitate and locate public and private expressions of grief. Again, this we have in the relationship of Aggie and Inti and their experience with grief, the death of their father, for example, which is also brought up throughout their time in Scotland. The experiences, or the abusive experiences they made with their mother, and also the abuse they both suffered through Gus. And they can be scenes of truth-seeking and justice-seeking. And of course, this is obvious in Inti's anarchy, as she takes the place of her mother by convicting Stuart in the middle of the forest. Her mother, as you might remember, is a lawyer that convicts men who abuse their women and who are guilty of femicide. So she takes on that role, and out of the motivation to seek a greater justice for what her sister and all other women who have become victims of domestic violence went through. Traumascapes can also act as portals. This is worked or included in the novel through the continuous flashbacks into Inti's and Aggie's past. Here again, we've got the negotiation of past and present, which is at the core of traumascapes, and they also transfer and externalize. This means that we have a movement towards the conscience. The trauma that the two women have lived through is addressed and processed, which sets them both free. So they have faced this, they have brought it into the consciousness, and therefore concluded this. And again, through the violation of women and the environment alike, the Highlands serve as a gendered and ecological traumascape in which past violence and present consequences and further violence are continuously negotiated. This brings me to the conclusion of my talk and the question whether or not there is still hope for humanity in the wake of the climate crisis. The climate crisis, as I've explained, exposes and intensifies human division, resulting in an increase of gender violence. I hope I've made this clear with the binaries that I pointed out in the novel. The Highlands as binary landscape embody the binaries of civilization's division. So in Inti's and Aggie's characters, we have these polar opposites of reaction, intolerance, and stillness, tolerance. Which draws a parallelism to our options, both concerning gender violence, but also with the climate crisis. And we have the lack of wilderness or wildness, which turns humans into monsters of violence. And therefore, the novel advocates for a rewilding of humanity, which is required for us to become wild again, so to say. I would like to end this talk with a quote by Margaret Atwood, which I think summarizes this quite beautifully. There is no inevitable future, just as there is no inevitable right side of history. There is no inevitable road to perdition. There is no inevitable road to Oz. But there are consequences of actions, not all of them foreseeable. Dark are the ways of wizards and of novelists as well. So thank you very much for your attention. And for all of those who are present here and who can speak German, I brought to you some flyers that we have designed with the Scientists for Future, our regional group. They summarize the current state of the climate, and on the back you will also find a list of things you can do and you can actually take action So if you're interested, please take one. Unfortunately, they only exist in German so far. We're still working on the English version, but yeah, take one if you're interested. Thank you very much.